For as long as anyone has studied the Pacific Northwest, there has been one earthquake in the back of every scientist's mind. One fault, offshore, silent and patient, the one they call simply the big one. And this month, a team of researchers published something that quietly rearranged that fear. Not that the big one is coming sooner, something stranger than that. That when it finally comes, it may not come alone. 326 years. That is how long it has been since the last time the fault off the coast of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia let go. Since the winter night in the year 1700, when 1,000 kilometers of the seafloor lurched at once, dropped the edge of the continent into the tide, and threw a wall of water clear across the Pacific Ocean to break on the shores of Japan, where not a single person had felt the ground so much as tremble. Not a fault line, a seam in the planet nearly the length of the west coast of a continent, locked, loading, and by the average rhythm of its own long history, overdue. For a century, the people who study this coast have braced for that one rupture. But the research that surfaced this month suggested something the nightmares had not accounted for. That the same great fault, when it finally slips, might in the same breath reach down the coast and wake a second sleeping giant, the San Andreas itself. And so, the question that has hung over the Pacific Northwest for 100 years quietly changed shape. It is no longer only, when does the big one come? It has become, how much of the West Coast goes at once? Before we go any further, if you find something worth staying for here at Earthquake, take a second to like and subscribe, so you don't miss any of our nightly reads. And leave a comment to tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Finding. To understand why a scientific paper could unsettle an entire region, you have to understand what the people of the Pacific Northwest have quietly learned to live above. Because unlike almost anywhere else in the earthquake world, the danger here spent most of the 20th century hidden in plain sight, unseen, unsuspected, denied even by the experts who should have known. For a long time, the coast of Oregon and Washington was thought to be relatively safe. There were small earthquakes, yes, the ordinary grumbling of any restless ground, but nothing catastrophic in living memory, nothing like the great ruptures of California or Japan or Chile, the offshore fault, the long boundary where one plate of the earth slides beneath another, sat quiet. And a quiet fault, to the intuitions of an earlier generation of scientists, looked like a harmless one. Perhaps some reasoned this particular boundary was not locked and loading at all. Perhaps the plates here simply slid past one another, smoothly, gently, without ever storing the strain that elsewhere built toward disaster. Perhaps the Pacific Northwest had been spared. It had not been spared. It had been deceived by the one thing this coast does better than almost any place on Earth, which is keep a secret. And over the last few decades, piece by piece, the secret came out. Buried forests of dead trees, drowned in salt water. Layers of sand laid down by waves that reached places no ordinary wave could reach. Records from across an ocean, in a country that had no reason to lie. And slowly, undeniably, a picture assembled itself that turned the map of American earthquake danger on its head. The quietest coast was not the safest, it was the most dangerous. It had simply been holding its breath for 3 centuries, and the reason no one had seen its power was that no living human being had ever watched it exhale. That fault has a name, the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and I want you to hold the shape of it in your mind because everything in this story hangs from it. Picture the entire western edge of the continent, from the top of California, past Oregon, past Washington, up to Vancouver Island in Canada, roughly 1,000 kilometers of coastline. Now picture, running parallel to that coast, a little offshore, beneath the cold grey water, a seam. Along that seam, a slab of the ocean floor is being forced down and under the edge of the continent, the way it has been for millions of years. Most of the time, that seam is stuck. And when a seam that long, holding that much strain, finally comes unstuck all at once, it produces the largest earthquakes the planet is capable of making. Magnitude 9. The kind of earthquake that does not merely damage a region, but rewrites it. That is the big one. Not a metaphor, not a myth, but a specific, physical, measurable event that has happened before, that will happen again, and that the entire modern Pacific Northwest, its cities, its bridges, its millions of people, has been built, for the most part, without ever having felt. So that is the ground the discovery landed on. Now here is the discovery. This month, researchers studying the deep history of this fault, reading it, as we will see, in layers of mud on the ocean floor, put forward a conclusion that reframed the threat. For 100 years, the fear had a single shape. One fault, Cascadia, letting go. But the new work argued that Cascadia may not be a solitary actor, that when the northern fault ruptures in a great earthquake, the violence of it may travel south, down the coast, and stress the top of another, even more famous fault, the San Andreas, hard enough to set it off too. Not months later, not years later, possibly within minutes, possibly within hours. A single catastrophic afternoon in which not one but two of the great fault systems of the west coast fail in sequence, and the shaking, and the tsunamis, and the ruin arrive not in one region, but up and down nearly the entire western edge of the United States at once. I want to be careful and honest with you, right here at the start, because this is the kind of claim that fear loves to inflate, and I have no interest in inflating it. This is a hypothesis. It is new research, argued from real evidence, published and taken seriously. But it is debated, not settled, not proven, and the scientists who proposed it would be the first to say so. Nobody has watched Cascadia trigger the San Andreas. It is a pattern read out of the mud of 3,000 years, a correlation that suggests a connection, a possibility raised rather than a certainty declared. Hold it as exactly that, but hold it too with the seriousness it deserves, because the people making the argument are not cranks or doomsayers. They are among the most respected earthquake scientists alive, and what they are describing is not impossible. It is, at worst, plausible, and plausible when the subject is the simultaneous failure of the two largest fault systems on the west coast of a continent is a very heavy word. And there was a second finding this same season, quieter than the first, but in its own way, just as unsettling. Using sound waves to image the fault far below the seafloor, another team looked directly at the slab of ocean floor, diving beneath the Pacific Northwest, and saw it tearing. A great piece of the descending plate off Vancouver Island fractured and dropping away, more than 3 miles down. One of the scientists described what they were seeing in a phrase that is hard to shake. A subduction zone, he said, caught in the act of dying. Now, a dying subduction zone is not a comforting phrase, but it does not mean what the fear wants it to mean. It does not mean the fault is about to explode. These are processes that unfold across hundreds of thousands of years. But it does mean that the machine beneath this coast is more complicated, more segmented, more capable of behaving in strange and uneven ways than the simple picture ever allowed. And a fault that can behave in strange and uneven ways is a fault that is harder to predict, harder to bound, harder to feel safe beside. Now here is the thing I most need you to understand about how this news arrived, because it tells you everything about the peculiar danger of this particular fault. When these findings surfaced, the ground itself was quiet. There was, around the same stretch of time, a small swarm of little earthquakes far offshore, a couple of dozen tiny shocks over a matter of hours, out in the deep ocean, none of them strong enough to do any harm at all. And the experts were quick and correct to say that the swarm meant nothing, that it posed no threat, that it was not even on the dangerous part of the fault. And they were right, but I want you to notice the strangeness of the situation. The frightening news was not the earthquake you could feel. The frightening news was the paper. The danger did not announce itself with shaking. It announced itself in a scientific journal, quietly, in the language of sediment cause and probability, while the ground stayed perfectly, deceptively still. And that is the whole nature of Cascadia in a single image. This is a fault whose defining feature is silence. It does not give you swarms of warning quakes that build toward the main event. The way some faults do, it does not mutter. For 326 years, it has said almost nothing at all, and that very silence is not the absence of danger. It is the danger accumulating in the only way this fault knows how to accumulate it, which is quietly, invisibly, and without any regard whatsoever for whether we are paying attention, which is why a paper can frighten a region that a swarm cannot. Because the people who study this coast have learned the hard way over decades that on the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the loud things are usually harmless, and the harmless-looking things are sometimes the whole story. The swarm you can feel is noise. The silence you cannot feel is the signal. And this month, reading that silence more deeply than anyone had read it before, scientists came back with a message that the region is still even now trying to absorb, that the nightmare it has braced for across a century may be larger and stranger and more far-reaching than the nightmare it thought it knew. To understand why any of that is possible, why a fault can stay silent for centuries and then unleash the largest earthquake on the continent, why one fault might be able to reach down the coast and wake another, you have to leave the surface and the news and the papers behind. You have to go down, beneath the grey water, beneath the seafloor, to the place where two vast plates of the earth have been locked in the same slow collision since long before there was anyone here to name it. You have to understand the machine. Part 2. The machine beneath the coast. Go down then. Past the grey skin of the water, past the drifting cold and the last of the light, down to where the ocean floor is not a floor at all, but a lid, and beneath that lid, the machine. I want you to build a picture of it slowly, because the whole story rests on this one piece of geometry, and once you have it in your body, you will never quite be able to unsee it. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, running in a long, slightly curved line from the redwood country of Northern California up past Oregon and Washington and on to Vancouver Island, there is a seam in the earth. It is roughly 1,000 kilometers long, call it 600 miles, a single unbroken argument between two enormous pieces of the planet. Geologists gave it a plain, almost bureaucratic name, the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Hold that word subduction gently in your mind for a moment, because we are going to take it apart until it means something. Here is the thing you have to understand first. The surface of the earth, the ground you're lying on, the seafloor, the mountains, all of it is not one solid shell. It is broken into plates, great rigid rafts of rock, dozens of kilometers thick, floating on a hot, slow plastic interior that behaves over long enough spans of time, almost like a fluid. These plates are always moving, not quickly, not in any way you could ever feel, but relentlessly, in every direction, grinding past one another and pulling apart and, in a few places, colliding head-on. Cascadia is one of those collisions, and in a collision between two plates, the question that decides everything is a simple one. Which one goes on top? Off that coast, two plates are meeting. One of them is called the Juan de Fuca plate, a slab of ocean floor, relatively young and relatively small, as these things go, made of dense, dark, heavy, oceanic rock. The other is the North American plate, the one carrying the entire continent, the cities and the forests, and you. Where they meet, the ocean plate is losing. It has to. Oceanic crust is denser than the buoyant continental rock riding above it, and when the dense meets the light, the dense goes down. The Juan de Fuca plate is being forced beneath the edge of North America and bent downward, driven at a shallow angle into the earth, plunging slowly toward the searing heat of the mantle far below. That is subduction. One plate diving beneath another, disappearing back into the planet that made it. Let me give you your hands, because your hands already know how to do this. Lay one flat on the table, palm down, and slide the other underneath it. Fingers first, pushing gently forward. Feel how the lower hand has to tilt down to get under the upper one. Feel how the upper hand rides up and over. That is the essential motion, held perfectly still and repeated over 10 million years. The Juan de Fuca plate is your lower hand, sliding down and under. The continent is the hand on top, being lifted and crumpled and carried. Everything that has ever happened along that coast. The volcanoes of the Cascade Range standing in their long line inland, the very existence of the mountains, is downstream of this one slow shove. Or think of it as a conveyor belt, if that sits easier. Far out in the ocean, along a ridge on the seafloor, brand new crust is being born, welling up as molten rock, cooling, hardening, and then being pushed steadily away from its birthplace, carried across the width of the sea, like luggage on a belt. And at the far end of the belt, at the coast, the belt turns downward and feeds the old ocean floor back into the earth. The Juan de Fuca plate is riding that belt toward its own disappearance. It is on its way down, and it has been for as long as there has been a Pacific Northwest to slide beneath. Now how fast? This is where the scale of the thing starts to become strange, and you have to slow your own sense of time down to meet it. The plate is moving at a few centimeters a year. Not a few centimeters an hour or a day, a year. That is roughly the pace at which your fingernail grows. Look at that, the tiny invisible, ceaseless creep at the edge of your own finger. The growth you never once catch in the act, but which, over months, undeniably happens. That is how fast a continent is being overridden. If you sat and watched the coast of Oregon for your entire life, staring, never blinking, you would see nothing. The motion is real, it is enormous in its consequences, and it is utterly beneath the threshold of anything a human being can perceive. This is the first silence. The machine runs and it makes no sound, and it shows no sign, and it does not stop. But here is the turn, the detail that takes this from a geology lesson to a loaded gun. The two plates do not slide smoothly past each other. If they did, if that ocean plate simply glided down and under, a few smooth centimeters a year, greased and easy, there would be no story here at all. The coast would creep along quietly forever. It does not slide smoothly. The boundary between the two plates, the actual contact surface, where the diving slab grinds against the underside of the continent, is called the megathrust. And along most of its length, for most of its depth, that megathrust is locked, stuck, held fast by friction, welded by the sheer crushing weight of a continent pressing down. The two plates fused at their contact so completely that right now, along that fault, they are not moving at all. Sit with the contradiction in that, because it is the heart of everything. The plate behind is still coming. The conveyor belt has not switched off. The deep, patient shove from far out in the ocean continues at its fingernail pace, second by second, year by year, and it does not care in the slightest that the fault at the front is jammed. So you have two facts that cannot both be comfortably true at once. The plates are converging, and the fault where they meet is stuck. Something has to give, and what gives for now is the rock itself. I want you to feel this with a stuck door, because you have almost certainly done it. A door swollen shut in its frame, painted over, jammed. You push. It does not open. You push harder, leaning your shoulder into it, and still nothing gives. But you can feel the strain going somewhere, into the wood, into the frame, into your own braced legs, the whole system tightening, storing the force you're pouring into it. Now imagine you could never stop pushing. Imagine you leaned on that door and kept leaning. For a year, for 100 years, the pressure never once relaxing, building and building against a door that will not open. That is the megathrust. The continent is the door. The diving plate is you, leaning endlessly. And the strain that has nowhere to go is being pressed into the rock on both sides of the fault, squeezed into the stone itself as pure stored elastic tension. Or take a wooden ruler or a green stick fresh off a branch and bend it slowly between your hands. At first it just curves and you can feel it wanting to spring back, storing the energy of your bending inside its fibers, patient, quiet, giving no indication of what is coming. You can hold it there, bent, humming with tension, and to anyone watching it simply looks like a curved stick. Nothing is happening, except that everything is happening. The entire future of that stick is being loaded into it, waiting on a threshold you cannot see. Keep bending. Keep bending. There is a point somewhere ahead where the wood can hold no more, and it does not soften and sag toward that point. It holds and holds and holds, and then it does not hold at all. That is what the rock along Cascadia is doing right now. Tonight, as you lie here, the land is being bent. Measure the coast with instruments precise enough, and you can catch it. The shoreline of the Pacific Northwest is being dragged very slightly inland and lifted, warped upward and landward, hunched like a shoulder braced against a door, because the locked fault is holding the leading edge of the continent, while the rest of the continent keeps trying to move. Decade after decade, the strain accumulates, drawn tighter, wound closer to a limit, storing up a century, or several centuries, of thwarted motion. Every year, the plate wanted to move a few centimeters and could not. Every year, that unspent motion was added to the account. And the account has been open, this time, for a very long while, filling in perfect, absolute silence. Now, what happens when a door that has been leaned on for 300 years finally opens? When a locked megathrust of that size lets go, it does not let go gently, and it does not let go a little at a time. It releases everything it has been holding, all at once, in a single catastrophic slip. And because a megathrust is the largest kind of fault surface on the planet, what it releases is the largest earthquake the planet can produce. We are talking about magnitude 9, and I need you to understand that magnitude is not a ruler, where 9 is just a bit more than 8. It is a scale that climbs in leaps. Each whole number is a massive multiplication of the energy released, so that a 9 is not slightly bigger than a 7. It is hundreds of times more powerful, releasing energy on a scale that has no useful comparison in ordinary human experience. Why so much? It comes down to two things, and they are worth understanding plainly, because they are the difference between an earthquake and a catastrophe. The first is area. An earthquake is the sudden slip of a fault, and the bigger the patch of fault that slips, the more energy comes out. An ordinary quake, the kind that cracks a wall, rattles the shelves, frightens a city, and passes, ruptures a fault a few kilometers, maybe a few tens of kilometers, across. A full Cascadia rupture can tear along the megathrust for hundreds of kilometers, potentially the entire 1,000-kilometer length of it. The fault unzipping from one end toward the other, like a seam giving way along its whole run. The second is slip, how far the two sides lurch past each other in that instant of release. In a small quake, the ground shifts by centimeters. When Cascadia goes, the plates can jump by tens of meters, the continent snapping forward and springing back in one convulsion, unloading all those centuries of stored bent stick tension in a matter of seconds. Enormous area multiplied by enormous slip. That product is the energy. That is why it is a 9. And that same size is why the shaking lasts the way it does. When you feel an ordinary earthquake, the whole thing is over in seconds, a jolt, a rolling, and then stillness, because the small fault ruptures fast and is finished. But a rupture that has to travel hundreds of kilometers takes time to travel. The fault tears along its length at a couple of kilometers a second, and every stretch of it, as it breaks, throws out its own wave of shaking, so the ground does not jolt and release you. It shakes and keeps shaking and keeps shaking, wave upon wave, arriving as the rupture races down the coast. Not seconds, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5. I want you to actually count that out sometime. Sit still and count off 4 full minutes of nothing, and then imagine every one of those seconds filled with the ground moving beneath you and refusing to stop. The mind is not built for it. We are built for the jolt that ends. This is the shaking that does not. And there is one more feature of this particular machine, planted right in its geometry, that I am going to set down here, and only half explain, because its full weight belongs to a later part of this story. The fault is offshore. It lies out under the sea, tens of kilometers off the coast and buried beneath the ocean floor. Now go back to your hands, the lower one sliding under, the upper one riding up. When the megathrust finally slips, the leading edge of the continent, which has been bent and held down all this time, snaps upward. It lifts, and it does not lift alone. Sitting on top of that stretch of seafloor is the entire weight of the ocean, thousands of feet of water, a mass beyond reckoning. And when the seafloor jumps, the water jumps with it. The whole column of the sea, over an area the size of a small country, is heaved upward in an instant. Hold on to that image and do not let it go. The ocean lifted. Cascadia is not only an earthquake machine. Cascadia is a machine for lifting the sea. What the risen water does next is a thing we will have to come back to, because it does not stay lifted and it does not stay out there. I want to place this fault among its own kind, so you understand it is not a strange local hazard, not some regional peculiarity of the American coast. The megathrust is a specific species of fault, and it is the same species everywhere on Earth that produces the very largest earthquakes ever recorded. The greatest quake in the modern instrumental record off the coast of Chile, a subduction megathrust exactly like this one. The immense Alaskan earthquake that lifted and dropped whole coastlines, a megathrust exactly like this one. The great quake off Japan and others before it, megathrusts, everyone. When a scientist tells you Cascadia is capable of a magnitude 9, they're not speculating or reaching for a frightening number. They are pointing at Cascadia's siblings, at the record of what this exact kind of fault has already done, again and again, on other coasts, in living memory. And then they are pointing back at this one, this 1,000-kilometer seam, sitting quietly off a shoreline where millions of people live and sleep and raise their children. And they are telling you it is the same machine, and running under the same rule as all the rest of it, the rule this whole story keeps circling back to. Everything I have just described to you, the diving plate, the locked fault, the bending of a continent, the centuries of strain wound tighter and tighter toward a threshold no one can see. All of it is happening in total silence, kilometers down, beneath cold water and dark rock. It has been happening for millions of years, and it is happening right now, and it will still be happening at dawn. There is no rumble that precedes it, no hum you could listen for. The land does not groan under the load. The most powerful process on this coastline, the one assembling the largest disaster it can possibly suffer, is also the quietest thing here. Quieter than the tide, quieter than the wind in the coast pines, doing its enormous and decisive work with no sound and no warning and no witness at all. And I want to leave you before we go on with the piece of this that unsettles the people who study it most. Because for a long time, that silence was read as safety. A coast where the ground does not shake, where generations come and go without a great earthquake, where the fault out in the water says nothing year after year after year, that looks to anyone living on it like a calm place, a safe place. It is the most natural mistake in the world to make, to hear no alarm and conclude there is no danger. But this is the exact fault where that instinct betrays you completely. Here, the silence is not the absence of the thing. The silence is the thing. The quiet is the fault loading, the strain gathering, the account filling toward the day it comes due. And that inversion, that on this coast the danger and the calm are not opposites, but the very same condition, that the stillness itself is what should frighten you, is the truth we have to look at directly now. Part 3. The danger is the silence. So sit with that silence for a moment, because it is the most important thing about this fault, and it is the thing your body is least equipped to understand. We are a species built for the loud and the sudden. Everything about the way you are wired, everything your nervous system learned across millions of years. was tuned to notice the snap of a branch, the flash of movement at the edge of the tree line, the sound that does not belong. Danger, to a creature like you, has always announced itself. It roars, it cracks, it rushes. And so, deep beneath the level of thought, you carry an assumption you were never taught and have never questioned. An assumption so basic that it feels less like a belief and more like the shape of reality itself, which is this, that if something were truly about to hurt you, you would be able to hear it coming, that the world gives warnings, that quiet means safe. Cascadia is the place where that assumption goes to die. I want you to understand that not all faults are silent, and the difference between the ones that speak and the ones that do not is the whole of the matter. Think of two people who each owe the world a great deal of money. The first is a careful, frequent payer. Every week, without fail, he settles a little of what he owes. Small amounts, unremarkable, easy to absorb. He is never entirely out of debt, but he is never deeply in it either, because he never lets the balance climb. His obligations are always being paid down in pieces, constantly, in the open. Living next to that man, you would feel the regular rhythm of his payments, and you would think, correctly, that he was a manageable neighbour. The second person pays nothing, not because he is free of debt, but because he has decided in some silent way he could not explain even to himself, to let it all accumulate. Year after year the balance grows, compounding in the dark, and he says nothing about it, shows no sign of it, gives no one any reason to worry. He seems, if anything, the calmer of the two. And then one day, the entire debt comes due at once, all of it, decades of it, in a single afternoon, and it does not come due gently. That is the difference between a chatty fault and a locked one. Some faults on this earth are the frequent payer. They slip and shudder often, releasing the strain that builds inside them in a steady patter of moderate earthquakes. Quakes large enough to feel, large enough to crack plaster and rattle windows, but bounded because the fault never lets the pressure climb very high before it lets a little of it go. A place threaded with faults like that is rarely quiet, and the noise, unnerving as it is the sound of the balance being paid down. The ceiling on such a fault is low precisely because it never stops paying. Cascadia is the other kind. Cascadia is the borrower who says nothing. It is what geologists call fully locked, and a locked fault for years, for decades, for centuries, releases almost nothing at all. The strain does not go anywhere. It has nowhere to go. It accumulates and accumulates and accumulates in a silence so complete that for a long stretch of human history we mistook it for peace. And here is the part I most want you to hold on to, because it inverts everything your instincts are telling you. On a fault like this, the silence is not the absence of the danger. The silence is the danger. The quiet you would take as reassurance is, in physical fact, the sound of the load being wound tighter. Every year that Cascadia says nothing is a year in which the debt grows and the eventual payment gets larger. A noisy fault is spending as it earns. A silent, locked fault is saving up, without your consent and without your knowledge, toward a sum you do not want to imagine being asked to pay all at once. There is a homelier version of the same idea, and it may reach you more directly than any talk of borrowers. You have met a door swollen shut in humid weather, a door that fits loosely in its frame, rattles at every breeze. It is always moving, always giving, never building any real resistance, and it will never surprise you. But a door swollen tight into its frame does the opposite. It does not rattle, it does not creak. You could lean on it, push on it, and it would not so much as tremble, and you would conclude reasonably that it was solid, fixed, going nowhere. And it is going nowhere, right up until the moment the force behind it exceeds what the wood can hold. And then it does not open, it bursts. The stillness of that door, the very quality that made it feel dependable, was the pressure finding no way out. Cascadia is a door swollen shut across 700 miles of coastline, and it has not rattled in a very long time. Now I have to tell you how badly we misread it. because the misreading is one of the most instructive stories in the whole of this science. And it is a story about exactly this, about intelligent, careful people looking straight at a silence and drawing precisely the wrong conclusion from it. For much of the 20th century, the Pacific Northwest was thought to be, in seismic terms, almost boring. The great earthquake belts of the world were understood to be loud places: Japan, Chile, Alaska, Kamchatka, coastlines that shook and made no secret of what lay beneath them. And when scientists turned their instruments toward the coast of Oregon and Washington and Northern California, they found, by comparison, next to nothing. No great historical quakes in the written record, no steady drumbeat of offshore tremors, a subduction zone that, by every measurement they knew how to take, appeared to be sitting quietly and behaving itself. So a comforting idea took hold, and I want you to notice how sensible it seemed at the time. Perhaps, some thought, the plates out there were not locked at all. Perhaps they were sliding past one another, smoothly, continuously, the way one greased surface slides over another. A process with a name, a seismic creep, the gentle and undramatic release of strain without any large earthquake at all. If that were true, then the silence made perfect sense. The fault was quiet because it had nothing to say. It was paying its debt in a whisper, a fraction of a millimetre at a time, so gradually that no instrument could catch it and no person could feel it. The coast in that reading was not a loaded gun. It was a machine idling harmlessly, and its stillness was proof. It was the most reasonable, wrong idea imaginable. Because the two possibility, it's a fault sliding so smoothly, it never needs to quake, and a fault locked so tightly, it cannot quake until it ruptures all at once. Produce from the outside, in the short term, exactly the same appearance. Both are quiet, both give you nothing to feel. Standing on the shore, with the tools of that era, you could not tell the creeping fault from the loaded one. And faced with two explanations for the same silence, people chose the one that let them sleep. They read the quiet as emptiness. It was the opposite of empty. It was full, and getting fuller, and the very thing they took as evidence of safety was the fingerprint of the largest danger on the continent. That, more than any single statistic, is the lesson I need you to carry out of this. We did not underestimate Cascadia because we were careless. We underestimated it because it is silent, and silence is the one language our fear has never learned to read. Let me make the two behaviours as clear as I can, because the whole personality of a fault lives in this distinction. Picture a belt sander, the tool with its loop of gritty belt running steadily over a roller. Switch it on, and the belt moves continuously, smoothly, shedding material in a fine and constant hiss. There are no jolts, there is no drama, the motion is unbroken, and if you had to describe its rhythm, you would say it has none, because it never stops to gather itself. That is a creeping plate boundary. The two sides are moving, the strain is being released, but it is released as fast as it accumulates. In a steady sliding that produces heat and dust and small tremors, and never, ever, a catastrophe. Segments of some faults genuinely behave this way, and where they do, the ground shudders often and lets you off relatively lightly. Now picture a ratchet, the mechanism in a socket wrench, the part that clicks. A ratchet does not move smoothly. A ratchet moves in a very particular way. It holds absolutely still, resisting, storing the force you put into it, and then it gives, suddenly, all at once, jumping to the next position with a hard mechanical snap before locking again. Hold, then jump. Silence, then release. Now imagine a ratchet that has jammed, one where the click will not come, where you go on cranking and the mechanism simply holds, taking up more and more of your force without moving at all, the tension climbing in the metal while nothing on the outside changes. It holds far past the point where you expected it to give. It holds until it cannot, and when it finally lets go, It does not advance one quiet notch. It releases everything you have loaded into it in a single violent lurch. That is a locked megathrust. That is Cascadia. Not the sander's endless forgiving hiss, but the jammed ratchet's long patient deceptive hold. The mechanism taking up strain by the year and the decade, giving no click, no warning, no honest sign of how much force is stored inside it, until the hold breaks. And when a fault 700 miles long behaves like a jammed ratchet, the lurch, when it comes, is not measured in inches. It is measured in the sudden motion of an entire edge of a continent. I have to add one more thing here, one more layer, because the real fault is stranger and less tidy than any single analogy, and honesty demands I tell you so. Cascadia is not one clean, uniform, obedient machine running the same way along its whole length. In recent years, as scientists have learned to look deeper and more finely at the slab of ocean floor descending beneath the coast, the Juan de Fuca plate, the piece of the earth being swallowed here, they have found that it is not a single, flawless sheet sliding smoothly down into the dark. In places, particularly off the coast of Vancouver Island, at the northern end, the descending slab appears to be fractured, torn, coming apart along its edges as it goes under. One scientist, describing what the new imaging revealed, called it something that has stayed with everyone who heard it, a subduction zone caught in the act of dying. I have to be very careful with that word, dying, because it is a word built to be misunderstood, and I do not want it to frighten you in the wrong direction. When a scientist says this subduction zone is dying, they are not saying it is about to explode. They are not describing a countdown. They are describing a process that unfolds across hundreds of thousands of years, a geological slow motion so vast that it makes a human lifetime look like a single frame of a film. The gradual, epical winding down of a system that has run for millions of years and will take an unimaginably long time to finally stop. Dying here is not a symptom of imminence. It is the opposite of sudden. Nothing about the word means soon, but it does mean something, and the something matters. A slab that is fracturing and tearing as it descends is not a slab that behaves the same way from end to end. It is segmented. It has seams. And a fault with seams does not have to break all at once, or all in the same manner, or with the same character, in the north as in the centre. The northern section, off Vancouver Island, where the slab is coming apart, may behave differently from the central and southern sections that run down past Washington and Oregon. The fault, in other words, is not a single lever that gets pulled cleanly. It is a jointed, uneven thing, and the great difficulty this creates is not that it makes Cascadia more explosive. It is that it makes Cascadia harder to bound, harder to fence in with a confident prediction, harder to stand beside and feel that you've taken its measure. And that is the deepest reason this fault refuses to reassure. A fault that behaved with perfect uniformity would at least be knowable. You could learn its habits and trust them. But a fault that is silent and uneven gives you neither the comfort of noise nor the comfort of regularity. It withholds the warning, and then it withholds even the certainty of how. When the warning is finally moot, it will choose to break. So bring it all back to where we began, to you, and to the ancient wiring you cannot switch off. You are a creature that fears the roar and trusts the quiet. You would flinch at a slammed door and stand at ease beside a swollen one. You are built from the marrow out to read silence as safety, and here, on this one coast, that reading is not merely mistaken, it is inverted, exactly and completely backward. The most dangerous fault in North America is dangerous precisely because it will not give you the signal your instincts are waiting for. It does its decisive work in the one register your body was never designed to fear. It loads in silence. It holds in silence. It will, in all likelihood, give its last centuries of accumulated strain in a silence that lasts right up until the ground. Itself becomes the sound. We cannot feel it building. We cannot hear it wind. Our nerves, so exquisitely tuned to the sudden, go slack in the presence of the slow, and the slow is where the whole of this story is being written. That is the cruelty and the fascination of it together. That the single largest event this continent can produce is being assembled right now beneath the sea in the one manner guaranteed to slip beneath our notice, which leaves us with a genuine problem, and it is worth naming plainly before we go on. If this fault will not speak to us in the present, if it offers no swarms, no tremors, no honest sign of the debt it is carrying, then how could anyone possibly know what it is capable of? How do you take the measure of a thing that has, in all of recorded local history, done nothing at all? You cannot interrogate the silence directly. It will not answer. And so the scientists who needed to understand this fault were forced to do something extraordinary. Since Cascadia would not tell them what it could do, they had to find a way to make it confess what it had already done. They had to learn to read its past, to go looking in mud and in ghost forests, and in the layered memory of the seafloor, for the fingerprints of earthquakes no human being had ever recorded. And the trail they followed to find those fingerprints is one of the strangest and most beautiful detective stories in all of science. A trail that begins, improbably, not on this coast at all, but with a mystery written down centuries ago on the far side of an entire ocean, in a country that had no idea it was keeping a record of a fault it could not see. Part 4. The Orphan Tsunami. There is a village on the Pacific coast of Japan, in the district we now call Iwate, and on a winter night, more than 3 centuries ago, the sea rose up out of the dark and came for it. This was the night of the 27th, going into the 28th of January, in the year we would number 1700, though the people there kept a different calendar and would have known it by a different name. What they knew, in the way you know things in your body before your mind catches up, was that the water was wrong. It came without the usual warning. It flooded the low fields where they grew their rice. It pushed into the houses along the shore and lifted the mats and the pots and the sleeping mats. It wrecked the salt kilns down at the water's edge, the ones where they boiled seawater down to the precious white crystal that was half their livelihood. The waves were not monstrous by the standards of the very worst disasters, somewhere between 2 and 5 meters, depending on the shape of the particular bay that funneled them, but they were high enough to ruin things, high enough to frighten people badly, high enough that someone, somewhere, thought to write it down. And here is the detail that would haunt the record for the next 300 years. There had been no earthquake. I want you to sit with how strange that is, because it is the whole beginning of the story. On the Japanese coast, tsunamis were not mysterious. People understood them, at least in outline. The ground heaves, sometimes violently, sometimes only enough to rattle the roof tiles, and then, minutes or tens of minutes later, the sea answers, shaking, then water. That was the order of things, the cause and its consequence, as reliable as thunder following lightning. You felt the earth move and you knew to run for high ground. That was the bargain. The earth at least gave you the courtesy of a warning. But not this time. This time there was only the second half of the sentence. The water came and destroyed and receded, and the ground had never trembled at all. No one had felt a thing. It was a consequence with no visible cause, an answer to a question no one had heard asked. Imagine hearing a door slam somewhere deep in a house you thought was empty, and no matter how many rooms you search, you never find the hand that closed it. That is the shape of the puzzle these villagers were left with. A tsunami orphaned, a great wave with no parent quake anywhere in the world they could feel or see. For centuries it stayed that way. The account of the flooded fields and the ruined salt kilns sat in the old Japanese records as a small unresolved anomaly, one of those entries that doesn't fit, that historians and scientists note and set aside because there is nothing to be done with it. An orphan, a wave whose mother was missing, and it would take an extraordinary act of scientific detective work generations later to go looking for that missing parent, and to find her, it turned out, on the far side of the largest ocean on Earth. because the parent earthquake had not happened near Japan at all. It had happened here, on the other rim of the Pacific, off the drowned coastline of the Pacific Northwest of North America, the fault we have been circling this whole time, the silent one, the locked one, the one keeping no calendar, had finally moved. It had ruptured with such violence, along such an enormous length, that it heaved the entire water column above it and sent a wall of ocean racing outward in every direction. Most of that water rolled east and drowned its own nearby shore in minutes, but some of it went the other way, west, out across the open Pacific, across thousands of kilometers of empty water. A wave borne off the coast of what is now Oregon and Washington travelled for something like 10 hours through the dark, and arrived, still tall enough to do damage, on the coast of Japan. The child crossed an ocean to be recorded, because it was born on a coast that, at that moment in history, kept no written record of its own. And this is the part I find almost unbearably beautiful, in the way that only a real detective story can be beautiful. Because the Japanese wrote things down, the date, the night, the height of the water in this bay and that bay, the specific damage. Scientists 3 centuries later could run the whole event backward. Think of it like this. If you know exactly when a sound reached you, and exactly how loud it was when it got there, and you know how fast sound travels, and how it fades with distance, you can work backward to when the sound was made, and where and how loud it must have been at the source. Tsunamis obey rules almost that clean. The speed of a tsunami across the deep ocean is set by the depth of the water beneath it, and we have mapped the depth of the Pacific. So from the arrival times up and down the Japanese coast, and the wave heights recorded there, researchers could reach back across the ocean and across 300 years and calculate the missing parent with startling precision. Here is what they found. The rupture struck at about 9 o'clock in the evening, Pacific time, on the 26th of January, in the year 1700. Not a vague window, an evening. A magnitude somewhere in the range of 8.7 to 9.2, a great earthquake. One of the largest kind the planet is capable of producing. A rupture that tore along roughly 1,000 kilometers of the fault, very nearly the entire length of the Cascadia margin, with the 2 plates lurching past each other by an average of around 20 meters. 20 meters. Picture a 4 or 5-story building, and picture the ground on one side of a line sliding that far past the ground on the other side, in a matter of minutes, along a seam longer than the distance from one end of California to the other. That is what the orphan's mother was. That is the event that a handful of ruined salt kilns in Japan quietly, patiently recorded on our behalf. A written record in a language from the far side of the sea that dated an earthquake on a coast which had no writing of its own to date it. There is a book about this, aptly named The Orphan Tsunami of 1700, and the whole story of how it was solved reads like the finest kind of mystery, the kind where every clue was sitting in plain sight for centuries, waiting for someone to ask the right question. But a date derived from arithmetic on the other side of an ocean, however elegant, is not proof on its own. If that were all we had, it would be a lovely theory and nothing more. What makes the story overwhelming, what turns it from clever inference into something you cannot argue with, is that when scientists came here, to the actual coast of the Pacific Northwest, and looked, the land itself had been keeping the same records all along. It had simply never been asked. 3 separate kinds of evidence from 3 completely different domains, all pointing at the same winter night. Let me show you each one, because each is its own small wonder. Start with the ghost forests, along the tidal edges of Washington and Oregon, in the marshes where rivers meet the sea. There are stands of dead trees. Western red cedar, mostly, great grey skeletons, bare of bark standing upright in the salt marsh, where no cedar should be able to grow because cedar is a tree of dry land, and these are rooted in ground that floods with every tide. They have been dead a long time. And for years no one could quite say why they were there, why a whole forest had died all at once and been left standing in the salt like the masts of a sunken fleet. Here is what happened to them, and it goes to the very heart of what this fault does. When a megathrust like Cascadia is locked and loading, the leading edge of the overriding plate, the edge the coast sits on, gets dragged down and bulged up in a particular way. The coast is held slightly high, cocked like the far end of a lever being pressed. When the fault finally lets go, that stored shape releases in an instant. The lever swings, and the coast, in the space of a single minute, drops. Not slowly, not over years. It falls 1 meter, 2 meters, sometimes more, straight down into the reach of the tide. We call it coseismic subsidence, which only means the land sinks at the moment the earthquake happens. And it is one of the eeriest things this fault can do. Imagine a stretch of living forest, cedar and spruce, standing on good dry ground above a river mouth. And imagine that ground dropping several feet in under a minute, so that by the next high tide the roots of those trees are standing in salt water. Salt kills them, not overnight, but surely. The salt tide poisons the roots, and the trees die where they stand, and because the land has sunk, the marsh mud comes in and buries the base of their trunks and preserves them. Ghost forests. And here is the thing that makes them a clock. When you take one of those dead cedars and read its growth rings, the tree writes its own last chapter for you, a ring for every year it lived, and then at the very outside, the final ring it managed to grow before the salt reached its heart. In the ghost forests of Cascadia, that outermost ring is the ring of 1699. The last full season these trees were alive was the growing season of the year 1699. They died in the winter that followed, the winter of 1699 into 1700. The trees and the arithmetic from Japan are pointing at the very same night. Then there is the sand. If you go into those same coastal marshes and cut down into the ground, carefully in a clean vertical slice, you do not find uniform mud. You find layers. Mostly it is the dark, rich, organic peat of a marsh, the slow accumulation of reeds and roots, the kind of soil that builds up gently over centuries when nothing dramatic is happening. But driven through that dark peat again and again, going down and down into deep time, are sheets of pale ocean sand, clean marine sand, the sand of the seafloor, and the beach lying in flat sheets inland, sometimes well inland, where no ordinary tide or river could ever have carried it. There is only one thing that lays a sheet of ocean sand across a marsh like that, all at once in a single event: a tsunami, a wave large enough to break over the coast and surge across the land, carrying the sea's own sand with it and dropping it as a blanket over the marsh before it retreats. Each of those pale layers is the fingerprint of one great wave, and when you count them, layer of peat, sheet of sand, layer of peat, sheet of sand, down through thousands of years, you are counting Cascadia's ruptures. Each sand sheet is a night like 1700. The topmost one, the youngest, the shallowest, sits right there at the level that matches the ghost forests and the orphan wave. The fault, it turns out, had been signing its own name in sand the entire time, one signature per catastrophe, stacked in order, a ledger written in the ground. And then, most humbling of all, there are the people who are here, because the coast was not empty on that January night. It was home, as it had been home for thousands of years, to nations of people all along it, from the shores of British Columbia down through Washington and Oregon into Northern California. And those peoples remembered, not in books but in something older and, it turns out, no less durable, in stories, carried down through the generations by voice, parent to child, for 300 years. Up and down the coast in many different languages and many different nations, there are accounts of a night the earth shook terribly, and the ocean came in and did not stop at the shore. Among the Huayat people of Vancouver Island, there is an account of the villages at Pachena Bay, of how, on a winter night, the ground shook, and the sea rose in the dark, and the people in the low villages by the water were lost, and only those who lived on the high ground, or who fled to it, survived to remember. For a long time, the wider scientific world did not think to treat such accounts as data. But they are data, they are testimony, precise and terrible and true, and when the geologists finally laid the oral histories beside the tree rings, beside the sand, beside the arithmetic from Japan, every one of these independent witnesses was describing the same event. The stories were right. They had been right the whole time, waiting, like everything else about this fault, to be believed. Sit for a moment with what has just happened here, because it is easy to rush past it. This fault told us nothing directly. It gave no press conference, left no instrument reading, offered not one felt tremor to the living memory of anyone keeping written records nearby. It kept, as it always keeps, its silence. And yet we know, with a confidence that borders on the absolute, that at around 9 in the evening, on the 26th of January, in the year 1700, it ruptured for 1,000 kilometers and moved the sea hard enough to break salt kilns on the other side of the world. We reconstructed its single most violent night, the date, the hour, the magnitude, the length of the tear, out of mud and dead trees, and remembered stories, and a wave that orphaned itself across an ocean. That is what it takes to read a fault that will not speak. You do not get to ask it. You have to become a detective, and let the dead cedars and the buried sand testify in its place. Now that ledger of sand and drowned forests does more than confirm a single date. Read down through the whole stack, count the layers, measure the peak between them, and you can begin to answer the question that matters most. Not just did it happen, but how often does it happen? And the buried record gives an answer. Cascadia produces these great ruptures, on average, roughly every 500 years. But I want you to hold on to that word average very tightly, because it is doing an enormous amount of work, and it is the easiest thing in this whole story to misunderstand. The interval between one great Cascadia quake and the next is not 500 years on a schedule. It is wildly irregular. The gaps in the record run anywhere from about 300 years to about 900. Some ruptures came only a few centuries apart. Some let the better part of a millennium go by. 500 is merely the middle of a very wide, very ragged range. It has now been about 326 years since 1700. You will hear that number, and you will hear the word overdue, and I need to be honest with you about exactly what that does and does not mean, because this is where fear runs, ahead of the facts. 326 years is comfortably inside the window this fault has used before. We are, by the average, within the span in which the next one can happen, and by the shorter intervals in the record, we are already well into it. That is a real statement, and it is not a small one, but it is a within-the-window statement, and nothing more. It is not a schedule. It is not a countdown. The fault is not a kettle that whistles when its time is up, not a clock ticking toward a chime. Overdue does not mean tomorrow, and it does not mean this year, and it does not mean any particular year at all, because the fault keeps no calendar, and never has. It could go in your lifetime. It could hold its silence for another 200 years. Both of those futures sit comfortably inside everything the sand and the trees have told us. The honest truth is the uncomfortable one. The probability is real, and it is not small, and the timing is genuinely unknown. And anyone who offers you a date is selling prophecy, not science. So this is where we stand. We know it is real because Japan wrote it down, and the cedars died to prove it. We know it happens again and again because the ground keeps the receipts in stacked sheets of sand. And we know we are inside the window without knowing where inside it we are. Which leaves one question, the one that has been waiting underneath all of this, the one your imagination has probably already started to ask. We know what 1700 did to a coastline of villages and forests and marshes, to a world of wood and salt and rice. But that world is gone. The coast that a rupture like 1700 would strike now is not made of cedar longhouses on high ground. It is made of cities, of highways and bridges and fuel lines and hospitals, of ports and airports, of millions of people asleep in the dark exactly as those villagers were asleep. So the question is no longer whether it will come, or even precisely when. The question is what a night like the 26th of January, 1700 would actually do, if it arrived tonight, over a modern world that has built itself, brick by brick, directly on top of the silence. Part 5. What the big one does. So hold that in your mind, that impossible symmetry, a fault that has ruptured before, that will rupture again, that we now know sits somewhere inside the window where it has always come due. And then let the question turn, slowly, the way a key turns in a lock. Not whether, not even really when, but what. What does a rupture like the one in 1700 actually do if it happens not to an empty coast of cedar forest and scattered villages, but to the world we have quietly, confidently built on top of the silence? The cities, the bridges, the fuel lines, the 7 million people who have never in their lives felt this fault so much as clear its throat. I want you to start with the ground itself, because everything begins there, and because the first thing you need to unlearn is what you think an earthquake feels like. When most people picture a big quake, they picture something fast, a violent lurch, a few seconds of terror, chandeliers swinging, and then it is over, and the survivors climb out into the dust. That is what an ordinary earthquake is, a crustal fault, a few tens of kilometers long, snaps in a handful of seconds, and the shaking that reaches you lasts at most, maybe 15 or 20 seconds, long enough to be the worst 15 seconds of your life, short enough that most things standing at the start are still standing at the end. Cascadia is not that. Cascadia is a fault the length of the coastline, and when the whole locked margin lets go, it does not release in seconds. The rupture tears along the fault for hundreds of kilometers, and the ground beneath the Pacific Northwest does not shake for 15 seconds. It shakes for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, in some models 5. I want you to actually sit inside that number for a moment, because it is almost impossible to feel from the outside. Count it out, slowly, the way you would count to calm a child, 1, 2, 3, and understand that at the end of your count, when every instinct in your body is screaming that surely it must be over now, surely nothing shakes for this long, the ground is still moving, and it has 3 more minutes to go. And here is why the duration is the thing, not just the strength. A building is not destroyed the way you break a stick, all at once. It is destroyed the way you work a stuck nail loose, back and forth, each cycle a little further than the last. Think of bending a paperclip. One bend does nothing. You can bend it once and straighten it, and it is fine. But bend it and straighten it, and bend it again, back and forth, and somewhere around the 20th cycle, the metal quietly gives up and the wire falls in two. That is what 3 to 5 minutes of shaking does to a city. The first 30 seconds, most things hold. The building sways, the joints flex, the welds strain, but they were built to take that. The second minute, the sway keeps coming, relentless, in the same rhythm. And now the weakened joint flexes past where it flexed before. And in the third minute, or the fourth, the thing that survived the first minute simply runs out of the strength it was spending, and it comes down. The earthquake does not need to hit harder. It only needs to not stop. Duration is the weapon. Now go down, beneath the streets, into the soil, because the ground is not the solid, dependable thing you have trusted your whole life to hold still. Much of the modern Northwest, the ports, the industrial flats, the filled land along the rivers, the neighbourhoods built on old floodplains, sits on soft, water-saturated sediment. And under long, hard shaking, that kind of ground does something that sounds like a nightmare and is simply physics. It liquefies. Let me give you the feeling of it, because you already know it in your body. Think of standing at the edge of the sea, on wet sand, right where the waves slide up and back. Stand still, and the sand holds you, firm, packed. But start to shift your weight, wiggle your feet, tap your heels, and the sand around them turns to soup. Water rises up between the grains. The grains lose their grip on each other, and suddenly you're sinking, the solid ground gone slack and liquid beneath you. That is liquefaction. It is exactly that, scaled up to a city. The shaking jostles the waterlogged soil until the grains float apart, and the ground, for a few catastrophic minutes, stops behaving like solid earth and starts behaving like a thick, dark liquid, and everything resting on it, roads, runways, pipelines, the foundations of buildings, entire wharves, tilts, sinks and slides. Things do not fall down so much as the ground opens its hand and lets them go. And on the slopes, the same principle wears a different face. Hillsides that have stood for 10,000 years, saturated with Pacific Northwest rain, shaken for 4 full minutes, come loose and move, landslides burying roads, taking out the thin ribbons of highway that thread the coastal mountains, cutting the small routes that a rescue would have to travel. The oldest, most vulnerable structures announce themselves first. Unreinforced brick, the beautiful old masonry of historic downtowns, buildings raised before anyone here designed for this, has no give in it at all. Brick is strong when you press down on it, and helpless when you shake it sideways. The walls simply peel away from the floors and fall into the street. Older bridges, older elevated highways, viaducts poured in an era that did not know what we know now. They were built to hold up weight, not to ride out 4 minutes of sideways violence, and many of them will not. And threaded through all of it, unseen, are the lines, the lifelines engineers call them, and the word has never been more exact. The buried pipes that carry natural gas, the mains that carry water, the pipelines and tank farms that carry fuel, many of them, by an accident of history, built on exactly the soft, liquefiable ground along the rivers that will fail first. When the earth pulls apart and slumps and slides, those lines rigid and brittle and jointed sheer, gas escapes, water pressure drops to nothing, which matters more than it sounds, because water pressure is what a fire hose is, and now, in the same minutes, you have severed gas lines and no water to fight what they ignite. The mechanisms stack. That is the quiet horror of a great earthquake. It is never one disaster. It is every system that a modern life silently depends on, failing together in the same 4 minutes, each failure removing the thing that might have contained the next. But I have been keeping you on land, and the land is not where this fault is most terrible. I planted an image earlier and told you to hold on to it. The ocean lifted. Now I have to give it back to you, and I need you to understand it not as a metaphor, but as a machine, because this is the part that kills fastest and forgives least. Remember what this fault is? The offshore plate has been diving under the continent, and the edge of the continent, snagged on it, has been dragged down and squeezed inward for centuries, held, loaded, silent. When the megathrust finally slips, all of that held-down land springs. The seafloor off the coast, the entire slab of it, lurches upward and seaward in seconds, meters of vertical jump across an area the size of a small country. And here is the thing you must feel. There is an entire ocean sitting on top of that seafloor. When the floor jumps up, it lifts every drop of water above it with it. You cannot lift the ocean and have it stay lifted. Water will not be piled. It collapses back down and outward. And that collapse, that vast, low, fast-moving hump of displaced sea, races for the shore. Picture a full bathtub, and picture shoving your hand up hard from the bottom. The water heaves, and a wave rolls out from your hand to the wall of the tub and climbs it. Now make the tub the size of the ocean, and your hand the size of Oregon. That is a tsunami. It is not a wave the way surf is a wave, a curl of water on top of a still sea. It is the whole depth of the ocean, floor to surface, set moving at once, and in the open water it travels at the speed of a jetliner. It only slows and rears up when it reaches the shallows near the coast. And when it slows, the water behind piles into the water in front, and the sea stands up. And now, the number that should change how you hear all of this. On the outer coast, the open beaches, the little towns tucked against the Pacific, the first waves can arrive in as little as 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes! I want you to hold that against the machinery we have built to protect ourselves. Detection, confirmation, the decision to issue a warning, the siren, the alert on the phone, even at its fastest, even working perfectly, that chain of official warning can lose the race. For the outer coast, there may be no message in time. The wave can arrive before the warning does, which means the warning cannot come from us. It has to come from the earth, and the earth does give it. It just gives it in a language people have to be taught to hear. The shaking itself is the alarm. That is the whole of it, and it is the single most important sentence in this entire story. If you're standing on that coast and the ground begins to shake and it does not stop, and it goes on past every earthquake you have ever imagined, long and hard and endless, that shaking is the tsunami warning. Not a sign one might follow, the warning. There is no siren more reliable than the ground under your feet, telling you for 3 unbroken minutes that the fault has let go. And the only correct response, the thing every child in those towns is now taught, is to move. The moment the shaking stops, and on foot, because the roads may be broken and the bridges may be down and gone, to move immediately and steadily uphill, to high ground, and not to wait, and not to go back, and not to be told, because of how high the water can come. The models, the real ones, built by the agencies whose job is to plan for this, put the tsunami's reach, its run-up, at 24, in places 30 metres above the sea in the worst locations. 30 metres. Reach for that height in a thing you know. A 10-story building. A wall of ocean as tall as a 10-story building, arriving where a moment ago there was a beach and a road and a row of shops, and arriving not as a curling breaker, but as a fast, dark, rising flood that does not crest and fall, but simply keeps coming and coming, carrying everything it lifts. You do not outrun it on the flat. You are only ever above it or inside it. That is why the hill is the whole answer, and why the minutes are everything, and why the coast that mistook its own long quiet for safety is the coast with the least time of all. Now pull back, all the way back, and look at the scale of what sits in the path of this. Roughly 7 million people live in the broader region this fault can reach, not a remote coastline. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, Tacoma, Olympia, Salem, Eugene. And then the entire outer coast, the long thread of small towns, the fishing harbours, and beach communities and tribal lands strung out along the edge of the continent, each one facing the water. 7 million people who built their whole world in the centuries of silence, and who have, almost none of them, ever felt this fault do anything at all. There is a line about this that has travelled further than any statistic, and it is worth telling you exactly where it comes from, because it has hardened into legend, and it deserves its facts. When a Pulitzer-winning piece in The New Yorker, Catherine Schultz's The Really Big One, brought this fault into the national imagination, it carried a sentence from the region's own emergency management director, a plain, grim assessment of the damage zone. Everything west of Interstate 5, he said, will be toast. West of that one highway, the great north-south line through the northwest is where the worst of it lives. The soft ground, the old infrastructure, the coast, the reach of the water. It is not a scientific measurement. It was a man whose whole job is to prepare for this, telling the truth in the bluntest words he had, because sometimes the plain word carries what the careful word cannot. And I want to be honest with you about what I am and am not telling you, because this subject breeds exactly the kind of fear that curdles into fantasy, and you deserve better than that. I am not going to hand you a death toll. I am not going to invent a number of the lost because no one honest knows it, and the number is not the point, and reaching for it would be a kind of lie. What the scientists and the agencies have actually modelled, FEMA, the USGS, the state planners, are mechanisms and physical effects. How long the shaking lasts, which ground fails, how the water moves and how high it reaches, how many bridges are likely to be impassable, how many buildings vulnerable, how long the power and the water and the roads stay gone. That is the projection. Everything I have told you is drawn from that kind of work, real scenario modelling built on the physics and on 1700, and I've tried to keep it exactly there, and not one step past it into the theatre of invented catastrophe. The truth is heavy enough. It does not need embroidering. And the truth includes one more thing, quieter than the shaking and the wave, that outlasts both of them, the isolation. Because when the bridges are down, and the highways are buried, and the coast has been struck from the sea, the region does not simply suffer and then recover. It is cut apart. The coastal towns, the ones that make it to the hill, come down from that hill into a place with no road out. The bridges that carried the aid are in the river. The airports are on the liquefied ground. The fuel to move the rescue is in the ruptured tank farms. And so the maps the planners draw are not really maps of destruction. They are maps of severance. A coastline of communities islanded, each one alone, for not hours but days, and in the hardest places weeks, waiting on a help that has to rebuild the very roads it needs to arrive on before it can arrive. The big one does not end when the ground stops moving. That is when its longest chapter begins. This is the shape of a single Cascadia rupture. One fault, letting go the way it let go in 1700, across a world that forgot it was there. 3 to 5 minutes of shaking, the ground turned to liquid, the lifelines cut, and behind it the ocean lifted and thrown at a coast that has 15 minutes and a hill. Take all of that, the whole staggering weight of it, and set it down in your mind as one complete thing, because you will need it whole for what comes next. For a long time this was the edge of the fear. This was the worst the map allowed. One margin, one rupture, terrible and sufficient. Scientists studied Cascadia as Cascadia, a fault sealed inside its own story, and the story ended at the water. But faults, it turns out, do not always read the boundaries we draw around them. And the newest work, The Discovery, published this very month, the reason any of us are talking about this now, asks a question that had been sitting just outside the frame the whole time, unasked because it was almost too large to say. What if the rupture does not stop where we assumed it stops? What if this fault, at its far end, is not as alone as it looks on the map? What if the big one, when it finally comes, does not come by itself? Part 6. The big one won't come alone. For as long as you have been listening, the danger has had a single address. One fault, one coastline, one long silent slab of rock off the Pacific Northwest, loading toward the day it finally slips. And that alone is enough to keep a person up at night. But this month, something changed in the shape of that fear, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because it is the kind of idea that sounds like a rumour and turns out to be a paper, real, published, argued from evidence, and taken seriously by people who have spent their whole lives reading this coast. Here is the thing. New research that surfaced this July, associated with a scientist named Chris Goldfinger, a man who has spent decades listening to Cascadia the way a doctor listens to a heart, argues something that the field has quietly circled for years and is now saying out loud. It argues that when Cascadia finally ruptures, it may not rupture alone, that the great offshore fault of the North and the most famous fault in America, the northern San Andreas down in California, may be linked, not by geography alone, but by consequence. That one could set off the other, that the big one, when it comes, might reach down the coast and pull the trigger on its neighbour, so that within minutes to hours of Cascadia letting go, the top of the San Andreas lets go too. I want you to sit with the size of that for a moment, before we get into how anyone could possibly know it, because the how is genuinely one of the most beautiful pieces of detective work in all of Earth science, and we will get there. But first, the shape of the claim. Not two disasters in 2 different decades. Not the West Coast is earthquake country. Sooner or later, something gives. The claim is nearer than that and stranger. The claim is that the 2 largest fault systems on the western edge of the continent may have a habit of failing together. Canada to California, the whole seam of the coast tearing in sequence, one catastrophe cued by the other, close enough in time that there is no recovering from the first before the second arrives. And I need to say something clearly right at the front, and I am going to keep saying it, because the entire weight of this depends on it being said honestly. This is a hypothesis. It is not settled fact. Nobody has ever watched Cascadia trigger the San Andreas. No instrument recorded it. No one alive has felt it. It is not written in any human record, in any diary or ship's log or newspaper. It is read, inferred, argued, reconstructed out of the mud at the bottom of the ocean, layer by layer, going back thousands of years. It is a strong idea and a debated one, and those 2 things are allowed to be true at the same time. So as we go, hold both. Hold how heavy it would be if it is right, and hold just as firmly that it is an if. So let me teach you how you read an earthquake out of mud, because this is the part that will change how you think about the whole ocean floor. Picture the edge of the continent underwater. Off the coast, the sea floor does not simply drop away into flat abyss. It slopes, a long steep downhill grade called the continental slope, and over that slope, century after century, sediment piles up, sand, silt, the fine dust of the land carried out by rivers, the slow rain of dead things from the water above. It sits there on the incline, loosely stacked, held in place by nothing but friction and time. It is, if you like, a snowfield on a hillside, stable until it isn't. Now shake it, not gently. Shake it the way a magnitude 9 earthquake shakes it, the entire slope convulsing at once. And that loose piled sediment does exactly what snow on a steep slope does when the mountain trembles. It lets go. It avalanches. Except this avalanche is underwater, a churning grey cloud of sediment and water sliding down the submarine canyons that groove the slope like the gullies of a mountainside, racing downhill in the dark, gathering speed until it spills out onto the deep ocean floor at the bottom and slows and stops and begins to settle. And here is the elegant part, the part that turns a landslide into a clock. When that cloud of stirred up sediment settles, it does not settle all at once and evenly. It settles by weight. The heaviest, coarsest grains, the sand, the grit, are too heavy to stay suspended, so they drop out first, fast, and form the bottom of the new layer. Then the medium grains settle on top of them. And last of all, drifting down slowest, because it is lightest, the finest material, the mud, the near dust, settles gently over the top like the last flakes of a snowfall. One event, one graded layer, coarse at the bottom, fine at the top, sorted top to tail by the physics of falling through water. Scientists have a name for that layer. They call it a turbidite. And every one of them is the fingerprint of a single shove. One great shaking, one avalanche, one earthquake, frozen into the seabed. Now imagine those layers stacking. The next big earthquake, centuries later, sends down its own avalanche, its own graded layer, settling on top of the last. And the next, and the next. Coarse to fine, one band for every great shaking, laid down in order, the oldest at the bottom and the youngest at the top. A stack of pages, and every page an earthquake. If you could drop a hollow tube down through the deep sea floor and pull up a long cylinder of that stacked sediment, a core, you would be holding the Earth's own logbook. You would be holding a calendar of catastrophes that no human hand ever wrote, going back not centuries, but millennia, roughly 3,000 years, and in places more. And this is how we know Cascadia's rhythm at all. This is where the number comes from. the sense that great quakes here recur on the order of every few centuries, on average, though never on a fixed schedule. Not from memory, from the mud, from counting the layers and dating them, band by band, reading the interval between one avalanche and the next, the way you might count tree rings, except each ring is a disaster, and the tree is the floor of the Pacific. So sit with that method for a moment, because it is doing something quietly extraordinary. It is turning silence into a record. Remember the through line we keep returning to. This fault's defining trait is that it does not announce itself. It does not mutter warnings. It works in silence, and yet even its silence leaves a trace, not a sound, not a tremor anyone felt, but a whisper of settled grit at the bottom of the sea, a page turned in the dark. The earthquake was violent for a few minutes 3 centuries ago, but the record of it settled slowly, silently, over hours and days, drifting down through cold water long after the shaking stopped. Once again, the loud part is the small part, and the slow, quiet part is the part that lasts. The evidence of the big one is not a scar you can hear. It is a layer you have to read, now. Here is where the new research does its unsettling thing, because Goldfinger and others did not only read the turbidities in the canyons off Cascadia, they read them off the northern San Andreas too, off California, where the same mechanism applies, the same avalanches settling into the same graded pages. There is a channel down there, the Noyo Channel, cut into the seafloor off the northern California coast, quietly stacking its own record of shakings. And when the researchers laid the 2 logbooks side by side, the Cascadia record and the Noyo record, north and south, 2 different faults hundreds of miles apart, they noticed something they were not looking for. The pages lined up. The layers matched in time. The earthquakes recorded off Cascadia and the earthquakes recorded off the northern San Andreas appeared again and again across the millennia, to fall at the same moments, or so close to the same moments that the mud could not tell them apart. Goldfinger has described the instant it dawned on them in plain, almost startled language, that a light bulb went on, and they realized the Noyo Channel was probably recording Cascadia earthquakes, and not only Cascadia's. San Andreas quakes too. 2 faults, 1 rhythm, written in 2 different stretches of seabed, in the same layers, at the same times, over and over, for thousands of years. Now, correlation is not the same as cause, and I want to be scrupulous about that, because it matters. 2 records lining up in time is a hint, not a verdict. It could mean the faults trigger each other. It could, in principle, mean something subtler, that a single vast shaking got recorded in 2 places, or that the dating has uncertainty wide enough to blur separate events into apparent twins. Reasonable scientists argue about exactly this. That argument is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. This is a hypothesis in the middle of being tested, not a conclusion carved in stone. But the pattern is there in the sediment, persistent enough that serious people cannot look away from it. And if you ask what it hints at, what the mud seems to be whispering, it whispers that these 2 faults have gone together, or very nearly together, again and again, and that there may be a reason. And there is a reason it would be physically plausible, which is the part that turns a statistical coincidence into something with a mechanism behind it. Picture the map. Cascadia runs down the coast from British Columbia, and its southern end does not simply fade into nothing. It comes down and meets near Cape Mendocino in Northern California, the top of the San Andreas, at one of the most geologically tangled spots on the entire west coast, a place where 3 tectonic plates all press against one another at once. Geologists call it the Mendocino Triple Junction. 3 plates, 3 faults, 1 crowded corner. And the northern tip of the San Andreas begins right there, at the doorstep of Cascadia's southern end. The 2 great faults are not strangers on opposite sides of the state. They are neighbours, shoulder to shoulder, meeting at a seam. So think back to the idea we built earlier, stress transfer, the shove that tips the next domino. When one fault ruptures, it does not release its strain into a vacuum. It shoves. It hands its stress to the rock around it, loading whatever is next in line, sometimes pushing a neighbouring fault that was already near its limit that last small distance over the edge. Now scale that idea up to the largest possible actors. A full Cascadia rupture, hundreds of miles of locked megathrust letting go at once, an entire margin of the continent lurching, unloading its violence right beside the northern end of the San Andreas. A fault that is itself always somewhere in its own long-loading cycle. If the San Andreas were already close, already strained, already waiting, then the arrival of the largest earthquake the region can produce, right next door, could be the shove. The last nudge, the domino that tips the next domino, except both dominoes are among the biggest faults on the continent. That is the hypothesis, whole. The correlation in the mud gives you the pattern. The triple junction gives you the mechanism. Together they suggest not prove, that Cascadia and the northern San Andreas may be capable of failing in sequence, one triggering the other within minutes to hours, a cascade running down the coast. And I need you to feel why that possibility, even held gently as a possibility, is so much heavier than one fault alone. Because everything you have been carrying so far has had a boundary to it. The big one is a Pacific Northwest catastrophe, enormous, generational but regional. You could imagine, in the terrible arithmetic of disaster planning, the rest of the country rushing in to help the corner that was hit. Convoys from California, aircraft from the south and east, a wounded region and a nation converging on it. That is the shape of every disaster response ever built, the unhurt helping the hurt. Now take that away. If this hypothesis is right, there is no unhurt neighbour to send the convoys, because the neighbour is on the floor too. Imagine the entire western seam of the continent failing in one afternoon. The Pacific Northwest shattered by Cascadia and Northern California shattered by the San Andreas, near simultaneously, Canada to California, all crying out at once. Every port, every coastal highway, every airport near the coast, every emergency response system in multiple states activated in the same hour, each one screaming for the help that its neighbours cannot send, because its neighbours are underneath their own rubble. The mutual aid that every plan quietly assumes, the idea that someone nearby will still be standing, gone, not one region's worst day, the West Coast's fault system failing as a single machine. That is the weight of it. And I keep returning to the word if on purpose, because the weight and the uncertainty have to be carried together, or the whole thing tips into something dishonest. This is not a prophecy. It is not a date. Nobody is telling you the two faults will go together next time, or that they must, or that they always have. Only that the sediment hints they sometimes have, and that the geography makes it possible, and that the idea is now on the table where the field can argue it into either sturdiness or dust. It might be right. It might be an artifact of the mud. That question is exactly what the next years of coring and dating and debate are for. But notice, and I want to leave you holding this, notice how the danger arrived. Not with a warning, not with a tremor anyone felt. This second, larger fear, the fear of the whole coast going at once, did not announce itself in shaking either. It came the way everything about this fault comes, quietly. It was read out of layered mud, out of graded grains settling in the dark, out of two silent logbooks that happened to agree. The most alarming idea in a generation of West Coast earthquake science, and it made no sound at all. It was there the whole time, at the bottom of the sea, waiting for someone to hold the two records side by side and see the pages line up. Once again, the earth did its most decisive work in silence and left us to find out slowly. And that leaves you and me in a hard and honest place, because if the big one is coming, or the two of them are, and it cannot be predicted, only forecast as a probability inside a window, if no one can hand you a date, and the fault will not mutter before it moves, then in the actual moment, when the slip finally begins offshore, there is only one thing left that could possibly help. Not prediction, warning. The difference between the two is everything. Prediction is knowing the year. Warning is knowing the next 10 seconds. And it turns out there is a way, a strange, almost unfair trick of physics, to steal a handful of seconds from a fault that has already started to break. Seconds ripped out of the ground, faster than the shaking itself can travel. It is not much, it is a breath. But when the coast is silent and the slab lets go, a breath is not nothing. So the question becomes, when the ground finally moves, what warning would the West Coast actually get? And how much of a head start can a machine wring from the earth before the earth arrives? Part 7. The seconds that listen. So warning, if the earth will not tell you in advance, if the fault gives no swarm, no mutter, no honest signal in the days or hours before it moves, then the only mercy left is a mercy measured in seconds. The thin margin between the instant a fault begins to tear and the instant the tearing reaches you. And that margin, it turns out, is not nothing. It is small, and it is fragile, and for some of you, it will not exist at all. But it is real, and human beings have built a machine to try and catch it. I want you to understand that machine, because it is the closest thing the West Coast has to a hand on your shoulder in the dark, and because its greatest strength and its most humbling limit are, strangely, the very same thing. The machine has a name. On the American side of the border it is called Shake Alert, and it is run by the United States Geological Survey, and it stretches its nervous system down the length of California and up through Oregon and Washington, the whole seismic coast wired for listening. It is the American cousin of the system that has watched over Mexico City for decades, the same idea grown into different ground. And here is the first thing you have to hold on to about it, because almost everyone gets it wrong the first time they hear the phrase early warning. Shake Alert cannot predict an earthquake. It cannot. Not tomorrow's, not next week's, not the big ones. It has no more idea than you do when the fault will finally slip. What it can do is something far narrower and far stranger, and in its own way, far more useful. It cannot tell you an earthquake is coming. It can tell you an earthquake has already started, and then it can beat the earthquake to your door. To understand how a warning can arrive before the disaster that caused it, you have to understand something about how the earth moves when it breaks. Because a rupture does not send out one single push. It sends out a family of waves, and they do not all travel at the same speed, and that difference in speed is the entire secret. That difference in speed is the whole trick, the only trick, the thing the machine is built to exploit. Picture the moment the fault lets go. Somewhere down in the dark, along that locked seam between the plates, the rock finally gives and energy floods outward in every direction. The first wave to leave, and the fastest, is what seismologists call the P wave, the primary wave. It is quick. It is the sprinter of the family. But it is also, relatively speaking, gentle, a compression, a push-pull through the rock, the ground squeezing and releasing along the direction of travel. If you feel it at all, you feel it as a sharp little jolt, a bump, a single knock at the door. It is not the wave that hurts you. It is a herald. It is the outrider who gallops ahead of the army to announce that the army is coming. Behind the P wave, slower, come the others. The S wave, the shear wave, and after it the surface waves that roll along the top of the ground like swells across water. These are the slow ones, and these are the killers. The S wave shakes the ground, side to side, perpendicular to its travel, whipping structures back and forth in the motion that snaps them. The surface waves roll and heave and can turn solid soil into something that behaves almost like liquid. This is the violence. This is the shaking that brings down the overpass and cracks the foundation and throws you off your feet. And it is slower than the herald that came before it. The destruction, quite literally, lags behind the announcement of the destruction. Let me give you the oldest and truest analogy for this. one you have known since you were a child, one your body already understands even if you have never once thought of it in these terms. Think of a thunderstorm. You see the lightning flash, instant, brilliant, arriving at your eye the moment it happens, because light is fast beyond comprehension, and then you wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the thunder rolls in, slow, low, arriving seconds later because sound crawls compared to light. The lightning and the thunder left the same place at the same instant, but one is fast and one is slow, and so you get a gap, and in that gap you count, and the count tells you how far away the storm is. The farther the storm, the longer the count. The P wave is your lightning. The killing waves are your thunder. And Shake Alert is a machine built to see the lightning and shout before the thunder can reach you. Here is how the shout gets ahead. When the fault first slips, the sensors nearest the source feel that fast P-wave arrive, the herald, the knock. In a fraction of a second, computers take those first tremors and read them the way a doctor reads the first irregular beat of a heart, estimating how big this is going to be, where it started, how far the destruction will reach. And the instant the machine is confident that a serious earthquake is genuinely underway, it does the one thing the earthquake cannot do. It sends a signal, a pulse of radio, a message across the internet, an electronic cry, and that signal travels at the speed of light. Not the speed of rock, the speed of light, which means the warning outruns the very waves that triggered it, races ahead of the slow, violent shaking, and arrives at cities that have not yet felt a thing. The news of the disaster arrives before the disaster. Read that again and let it settle, because it is one of the few genuinely hopeful sentences in this entire story. The news of the disaster arrives before the disaster. Imagine a lookout standing on a high dune at the edge of a long beach. Far down the shoreline, they see a wave surge in, a big one, a dangerous one, still distant. The water itself will take time to travel down the beach to where the swimmers are. But the lookout does not have to travel at the speed of water. The lookout can cup their hands and shout, and the shout races down the sand far faster than the wave can follow. And by the time the water arrives, the people who heard the cry are already up the beach, already moving, already safe. The warning and the wave leave the same event, but the warning takes the faster road. That is Shake Alert. It is a lookout on a dune, shouting at the speed of light down a coastline made of copper and radio. And now I want you to think carefully about what a shout like that is actually worth. Because when people first hear that the warning might only buy 10 seconds or 20, or in the best cases a minute or two, they tend to shrug. What good is 10 seconds? What can anyone possibly do with 10 seconds? And the answer, it turns out, is a great deal. 10 seconds is not enough to flee a city, but it was never meant to be. 10 seconds is enough for a very long list of small decisive acts, each one the difference between someone walking away and someone not. In 10 seconds, a surgeon standing over an open body can lift the scalpel and hold it still, so that when the room begins to lurch, the blade is not inside anyone. In 10 seconds, a train doing 70 miles an hour can begin to brake, and a train that is braking when the rails buckle is a train that stays on the rails instead of leaving them. In 10 seconds, an elevator can be told to stop at the nearest floor and open its doors, so that no one is sealed in a swaying box between floors when the power dies. In 10 seconds, an automatic valve can close on a gas line, and a closed gas line is a fire that never starts, a block that does not burn in the hours after the shaking stops. In 10 seconds, a factory can halt a machine, a utility can trip a switch, a bridge can flash a signal that turns the cars away, and in 10 seconds, a child in a classroom can get under a desk. A person walking beneath a storefront of tall glass, about to step out into the street, can instead stop where they are and not be standing in the open when the windows come down like a hard, clear rain. Someone asleep can be woken by an alarm and roll off the bed and onto the floor beside it, into the safest small space in the room. Drop, cover, hold on. The whole discipline of surviving a shaking building fits inside a handful of seconds, and a handful of seconds is exactly what the machine is built to hand you. It does not buy escape, it buys posture. It buys the difference between being caught standing and being caught braced. And across millions of people, that difference is measured in lives. But now we arrive at the limit. And I have to be honest with you about it, because this is where the machine, for all its brilliance, runs into a wall that no engineering can climb. A wall built out of nothing but distance and the speed of waves. And for Cascadia, of all the faults in the world, this limit is cruelest. Understand what the warning is actually made of. The lead time, the seconds you get, is nothing more than the size of the gap between the fast herald wave and the slow killing wave. That is all it is, and that gap has a single ruler. How far you are from where the rupture began. Far from the source, the fast wave arrives, well ahead of the slow one. The count between them is long, and the warning is generous. Close to the source, the two waves are almost on top of each other. The count is short, and the warning shrinks toward nothing. And directly above the rupture, standing on the ground right over the place where the rock is tearing, the fast wave and the slow wave arrive together in the same breath, and there is no gap at all. No count, no lightning then thunder. Just both at once. The warning, remember, is made entirely of distance. Where there is no distance, there is no warning. The lookout shout means nothing to the swimmer standing directly beneath the wave. Now lay that law across the map of the Pacific Northwest and feel how it cuts. The Cascadia rupture, when it comes, will tear along a fault that lies offshore, out under the cold water, running the length of the coast. The great inland cities, Portland, Seattle, the dense valleys where most of the people are, sit at a distance from that offshore seam, tens of miles. And so for them, the machine works, and works well. When the fault lets go out at sea, the fast wave will race inland. Shake Alert will read it and shout at the speed of light. And Portland and Seattle may get tens of seconds, in the best reckoning perhaps a minute or two, before the slow, heavy waves come rolling in beneath them. That is genuine. That is time enough for the surgeon and the train and the child under the desk. Time enough to matter across a whole crowded city. For the inland millions, the lookout's shout arrives, with room to spare. But hold in your mind the people we have already spent this story worrying about. The coastal towns, the small communities strung along the very edge of the water, the ones who, after a Cascadia quake, will have only 15 or 20 minutes before the sea draws back and returns as a tsunami. Ask where they sit in relation to the rupture, and the answer is the cruelest sentence that physics can produce. They sit almost directly on top of it. They are the closest of anyone to the source, and so, by the same law that gives the inland cities their generous head start, the coastal towns get the least electronic warning of all. The people who will have the shortest time to run are the people the machine can warn the latest. The shout reaches them last precisely because they are standing nearest the thing that made the sound. Distance is the currency of warning, and they have almost none to spend. And so for them the system arrives at its final humbling truth, the place where the machine bows out and hands the job back to something older. For the coast, the real warning was never going to come from a network of sensors and a pulse of radio. The real warning is the one the earth delivers directly into the soles of your feet. If you are standing on that coastline and the ground begins to shake, not a quick jolt, not a passing bump, but a long, hard rolling motion that goes on and refuses to stop. 30 seconds, a minute, longer than any earthquake you have ever felt, has any right to last. Then that shaking is not something to wait out. That shaking is the message. That is the fault itself telling you, in the only language it has ever spoken, that the sea is coming. You do not wait for an alert. You do not check your phone. The prolonged, violent shaking near the coast is the alarm, and the only correct response to it is to move, on foot toward high ground, the moment your feet are steady enough to carry you. Warning system, or no warning system, the ground is the siren. The earth, which gives no advance notice at all, gives this one thing at the very end, a felt, unmistakable order to climb. And there it is, the through line running straight through the heart of the machine. Everything we have built, the sensors on the seafloor, the computers reading the first tremor, the shout at the speed of light, all of it is a single, ingenious, desperate attempt to buy back a few seconds of warning from a fault that offers no other. To pry open the smallest possible gap in a silence that is otherwise total. The felt part, when it finally comes, is the loud and terrible small part. The long silence before it was the vast and decisive part, loading unseen. And the whole apparatus of early warning is us, refusing to accept that the silence gets the last word, clawing back 10 seconds, 20, a minute, from a process that spent 3 centuries telling us nothing. It is a magnificent thing to have built, and it is, in the end, only seconds. A hand on the shoulder in the dark, not a way out, a way to be ready, which leaves the hardest part of this whole story unaddressed, not the fault, not the waves, not the machine, but the people. The ones who live on this ground right now, tonight, going to sleep above a locked seam that has been silent for 326 years. Because once you know all of this, Waikoi, that the threat is real, that it cannot be predicted, that the warning can offer only seconds and for some, none at all, you are left holding a strange and heavy kind of knowledge. You are left with that word, overdue, and all the ways it gets misread. You are left wondering what to believe, and whom, in a world full of voices that will happily tell you the fault has a schedule. You are left with the deeply human problem of how to carry a danger that is certain in the long run and completely unknowable in its timing. How to hold something that is both absolutely coming and absolutely unscheduled and still somehow sleep at night above it. That is where we have to go next. Not down into the rock this time, but into the minds of the people who live with it. Part 8. Overdue. So what do you do with a word like that? Overdue. It is a strange thing to be handed, if you stop and really hold it, because it does not tell you to run, and it does not let you rest. It is not a date. It is not a warning, in any sense your body knows how to use. It is a statement about a window, a long grey window of years and decades, and you happen to be standing somewhere inside it, and no one, not one person alive, can tell you where. I want you to imagine what it is actually like to carry that. Not the version in the documentaries, not the wall of water and the collapsing bridge, but the ordinary version, the one that millions of people carry every single day along that coast without ever once mentioning it out loud. Because that is the real shape of this fear. It is not a scream, it is a hum. It is the low, almost inaudible frequency underneath a normal life. The kind of sound you stop hearing because it never stops. The refrigerator in the next room. The blood in your own ears. You live in Portland, in Seattle, in a small town on the Oregon coast where the cannery used to be, and you raise your kids, and you drive to work, and you argue about parking, and somewhere far below all of that, folded so deep you would swear it was gone, is a single sentence you learned once, and never quite unlearned. The ground here is not finished, and most days it stays folded. That is the mercy of the human mind. And it is not weakness, I want to be clear about that. It is not denial in the shameful sense. It is the only way to live on a fault. You cannot stand at the window every morning bracing for the sea. You would come apart. So the mind does what the mind does with every large and unfixable truth. The ones about mortality and loss and the sun eventually going out. It files it. It puts it in the deep drawer and closes the drawer and goes to make breakfast. But the drawer does not lock. And every so often something slides it open. A truck goes by heavy on the road, and the house gives one small shudder, and for a quarter of a second, before your thinking mind can catch up and explain it, something older in you goes still and listens. Is this it? A dish settles in the rack. A door thuds somewhere in the building. A real quake hits, a small one, a magnitude 3 somewhere out in the sound, just enough to make the hanging lamp swing and the water in the glass tremble in those fine concentric rings. And for a few seconds, every person in the city is thinking the exact same thought, and none of them are saying it. And then it stops, and the lamp settles, and you laugh a little at yourself, and you pick up your coffee, and the drawer slides shut again. That is the weight of overdue, not terror, a hum and a drawer that will not quite lock, and a body that has learned to flinch at trucks. Now, when something like this month's discovery arrives, when new research surfaces and says this fault may be even more connected, even more capable than we feared, that hum gets louder for a while. And here is where I have to talk to you very honestly, because what happens next is one of the most human things in the world, and it deserves to be met with respect rather than mockery. Every time a finding like this breaks, it does not travel alone. Alongside the careful coverage, the measured articles, the scientists chosen for their words, there comes a second wave, and that wave is made of fear looking for a shape. People stitch things together. They take this fault and they lay it next to the earthquake that struck Chiapas and the one that shook Venezuela, and they draw a line from one to the other and out along the whole burning rim of the Pacific, the ring of fire, and they say, "Look, look, it is all connected, it is all waking up at once." They point to a full moon, a blood moon, a rare alignment of planets. They find accounts that promise the day and the hour. Someone announces, with total confidence, that the big one is finally here. This week, this weekend, mark it down. And I understand the instinct completely. I do not stand above it. Because think about what fear actually wants. Fear does not want to be afraid. Fear wants to be finished. It wants the one thing this fault will never, ever give it, which is a time and a place. If you could just know the date, you could prepare for the date, you could brace for the date, and then afterward, you could rest. The unbearable part is not the danger. The unbearable part is the not knowing, the open-ended window, the drawer that will not lock. And so the mind reaches desperately and understandably for anyone who will close it, for a pattern, for a profit, for a number circled on a calendar, because a terrible certainty feels, to a frightened animal, more survivable than an endless maybe. So I'm not going to laugh at that, but I am going to draw a line, and I am going to draw it firmly, because your peace of mind depends on knowing exactly where it is. There is a difference between prediction and forecast, and it is the whole difference in the world. Let me give it to you as plainly as I can. Prediction is telling you it will rain on Thursday at 3 p.m. on this street. Forecast is telling you it is October in a rainforest and there is an 80% chance of rain this week. One of those is real science. The other is prophecy wearing a lab coat. Earthquakes cannot be predicted. I want you to hear that without any softening. Not by a scientist, not by a government agency, not by an app on your phone, not by an animal acting strange, not by an ache in an old injury, not by the moon, not by any method anyone has ever devised in the entire history of the human species. No one can tell you the day, the place, and the size. No one. The person who claims they can is not ahead of the science. They are selling you something, and what they are selling is the closing of that drawer, and the drawer is not real, and neither is the piece they are offering. But, and this is the part that matters, forecast is real, forecast is powerful. Forecast is one of the genuine triumphs of the earth sciences, and it does not give you a date, it gives you something more honest and, if you let it, more useful. It gives you probability over time. It is the meteorologist, not the weather prophet. The meteorologist cannot tell you it will rain at 3 on Thursday, but the meteorologist can tell you, with real rigour and real numbers, what kind of season you are living in, and what you would be a fool not to prepare for. So let me give you the actual numbers, not the ones from the prediction accounts, the real ones, the sober ones, the ones from the people who have spent their lives measuring this coast. And I want you to hold on to these because they are the antidote to both the panic and the denial. They are the truth in the middle. Over the next 50 years, the official estimate for a full rupture of the entire fault, the complete margin, the true magnitude 9 that levels the whole region at once, is roughly a 10 to 15% chance. Sit with that. It is not 0, not remotely. 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 is not a number you wave away. It is far too high to ignore and far too high to build a coast without respecting it. But it is also not a coin flip, and it is not this weekend, and no full moon changes it by a hair. For the southern portion of the fault, the part off northern California and southern Oregon, which can rupture on its own without taking the whole margin with it, the odds over that same 50 years of a magnitude 8 or greater are higher, somewhere around 30%, closer to 1 in 3. Still not a date, still a forecast, not a schedule. And then there is the number almost everyone forgets, and it is, in a strange way, the most important one for the most people. Beneath the Puget Sound, beneath Seattle itself, down deep inside the descending slab of rock, there is roughly an 85% chance over the next 50 years of a magnitude 6.5 or greater. That is a serious, damaging, life-changing earthquake. And here is the thing you must understand about it. That one is not even the big one. It is a different beast entirely, a deep quake in a different part of the machine, and yet it is nearly a sure thing across a lifetime, where the famous megathrust is a maybe. Do you see what that means? It means the largest earthquake most people on that coast will actually live through may not be the legendary one at all. It may be the other one, the one nobody made a documentary about, the deep one under the city that is almost certain to come and almost nobody is picturing. The big one owns the imagination, but the merely large one owns the probability, and a person who has bolted their bookshelves to the wall against the deep Seattle quake is far better prepared than a person who spends every night dreading the megathrust and does nothing about it, because both threats want the same thing from you, and it is not fear, it is furniture straps and a flashlight and a plan. So what then about this month? What did this new discovery actually do to any of these numbers? And I need to be very careful here, because this is precisely the point where fear wants to rush in and misread things. The new research strengthens the case. It adds weight to the argument that this fault is real and dangerous, and possibly linked in ways we did not fully appreciate to the great fault to the south, that when it moves, it may not move alone. That is genuinely significant, and it is genuinely unsettling, and it deserves the attention it is getting. But hold on to this, because it is the whole discipline of thinking clearly about this coast. It does not move the clock. It does not hand you a date. It does not mean sooner. A finding that the earthquake could be worse than we thought is not the same as a finding that it is coming faster than we thought, and the human mind, frightened, collapses those two into one. Do not let it. Understanding a danger more deeply is not the same as the danger arriving. The window did not shrink this month. Our picture of what waits at the end of it got sharper and larger, and that is a different thing. And so we arrive back where we always arrive with this fault, at the one truth it will never let us escape. Real probability, unknowable timing. You can have one or the other in most of life, certainty about whether or certainty about when. But this coast gives you only the first and flatly refuses the second. It says, yes, this will happen. It says, no, I will not tell you when. And that combination, that maddening, irreducible pairing of a certain event and an uncertain hour, is not a gap in our knowledge that better instruments will someday close. It may simply be the nature of the thing. It is exactly what keeps the scientists at their screens, watching a fault that gives them almost nothing to watch, precisely because they cannot look away from a threat that will not tell them when. Which brings me, in the end, to the two kinds of people. Because everyone who hears about this fault becomes, quietly, one of two kinds, and the difference between them is not what you would guess. The first kind hears the word overdue, feels that small cold flicker of fear, the drawer sliding open for a moment, and then closes it and forgets. By the weekend, it is gone. And I want to say clearly, that is not a failure. That is the healthy human default. That is the mind protecting itself, so a life can be lived. You cannot ask a whole coast to stand rigid with dread for 300 years. The forgetting is not stupidity, it is survival, and it is most of us, and there is no shame in it at all. But there is a second kind, and the second kind cannot forget. Not because they're braver, and not because they're more afraid, that is the thing everyone gets wrong. The scientist who keeps watching, the emergency planner drawing evacuation routes, the man who spent a Saturday bolting his water heater to the studs, the woman who packed a go bag and put it by the door and walked her children along the tsunami route until they could find the high ground in the dark, half asleep. From memory, these people are not more frightened than you. Many of them are calmer than you. What separates them is not fear, it is memory, and it is attention, and it is a stubborn, unglamorous willingness to keep taking seriously a danger that refuses, day after ordinary day, to feel urgent, to keep the drawer open on purpose, just a crack, just enough, when every instinct in the body wants to slam it shut and go make breakfast. And that, more than any magnitude, more than any percentage, is the real question. This fault asks of the people who live above it. Not are you afraid? Fear is easy, fear is cheap, fear burns out by Sunday. The question is whether you can hold a quiet truth steadily, without panic and without denial, in that narrow, honest space between the two. Whether you can look at a danger that is certain in the long run and silent in the near one, and neither run screaming nor turn away, but simply, calmly prepare and then go on living. Because in the end, this is what the coast has been trying to teach us all along, in the only language it speaks, which is the language of strain and silence, and the long patient loading of a spring we cannot see. It is not a language of warnings. It does not shout. It accumulates quietly beneath the breakfasts and the traffic and the trembling water in the glass, and it waits, and it says almost nothing, and the almost nothing is the whole message. We are only just beginning to learn how to read it, and what it is asking of us underneath all the numbers and all the fear is something quieter and harder than panic, and older than denial, a way of standing on ground that will one day move, and knowing it and staying anyway. Part 9. The signal we cannot read. The signal. So let us stand finally where all of this has been carrying us. Not on the shore this time, and not down in the dark beneath the seafloor, but somewhere quieter and closer to home. In an ordinary bedroom, in an ordinary house in Portland, or Seattle, or a small town on the Oregon coast where the fog comes in off the water at night. On an evening indistinguishable from any other, with the lights going out one by one down the street, and the whole region settling towards sleep above a fault that has said nothing for 326 years, and is saying nothing still. That is the truest picture I can leave you with. Not the wave, not the collapse, the stillness. Because the stillness is where this fault actually lives, and the stillness is the thing the whole story has been trying to teach you to hear differently. When you began listening tonight, silence on a coastline meant safety, the way it has always meant safety to every creature that ever startled at a sound in the dark. And now, I hope, it means something else. Now when you picture that quiet coast, you know what the quiet is. It is not peace, it is loading. It is the slow, patient, invisible winding of a spring, the length of a continent's edge, a debt accumulating in a silence so complete that for most of a century, the people who study it mistook it for nothing at all. The calm is not the absence of the danger. The calm is the danger, wearing the one disguise our instincts can never see through. And this is where I have to be honest with you about what we know and what we do not. Because you have come a long way down into this and you have earned the whole truth unsoftened. We know this fault is real because Japan wrote its last rupture down and the drowned seeders died to confirm it. We know it will happen again because the seafloor keeps the receipts in stacked sheets of sand and graded mud, one layer per catastrophe, going back thousands of years. We know we are inside the window without knowing where inside it we stand. And now, from the research of this very month, we know something newer and heavier still, that when it comes, it may not come alone, that the two great faults of the West Coast may be bound together in ways we are only beginning to read out of the dark. But we do not know when. We cannot know when. Not this year, not this decade, not in any form that could be circled on a calendar, because the fault keeps no calendar, and it never has, and it never will. Real danger. Unknowable hour. That pairing is not a gap that better science will someday close. It may simply be the nature of the thing, and learning to live with it honestly is close to the whole of what this coast asks of the people who live above it. So what do you actually do with that? If you cannot be told the day, if the prophets are frauds, and the fault will not mutter before it moves, how are you meant to sleep tonight in that ordinary bedroom above the silence? And the answer, it turns out, is neither of the two things the frightened mind reaches for. It is not dread, the clenched, exhausting, nightly bracing for a catastrophe that may not arrive in your lifetime, because dread changes nothing and steals the ordinary days that are in the end almost all the days there are. And it is not denial, the comfortable pretense that a coast quiet for 3 centuries will stay quiet forever, because that is precisely the belief this fault has punished before, the same belief that let an entire region build itself, unprepared, directly on top of the loaded spring. The honest response is the harder, humbler thing that sits between them, and it is smaller and more ordinary than fear wants it to be. You understand the danger clearly, and you do not look away from it, and then you prepare plainly and practically for the thing you cannot predict. And having prepared, you let the ordinary days be ordinary. You learn where you live. If you're on the outer coast, you learn the way to high ground the way you learned your own name. You walk it in daylight and in the dark, until your feet know it without your mind. Because when the moment comes, the roads may be broken and the bridges gone, and there may be no one left to tell you which way is up. You learn the one sentence that matters more than any siren, that if the ground shakes long and hard near the coast, that shaking is the tsunami warning. And you move, on foot, uphill, the moment you can stand, and you do not wait, and you do not go back. You bolt the tall bookshelf to the wall. You strap the water heater to the studs. You put a little water aside, a little food, a flashlight, a pair of shoes under the bed for the night. The windows come down as glass. You learn the 3 words that have saved more lives than any prediction ever will. Drop, cover, hold on. And then, having done all of that, you close the drawer gently and you live, fully, and without pretending either that you're safe or that you're doomed. Because the truth, as it almost always is the harder and quieter thing in between. Because here is what this coast is in the end, when you strip away the fear and the prophecy and the headlines that come and go in an afternoon. It is not malevolent. It is not counting down to your ruin, not choosing its moment for the pain that moment will cause, whatever the animal part of your mind insists as it lies awake, listening to a truck pass in the night. It is a machine, indifferent and ancient beyond any human sense of ancient, doing what it has always done, building this coast and in the same slow breath preparing to unbuild it on a clock that treats the whole of recorded human history as a single held moment. For 326 years, it has been silent. In that silence, it has been speaking the entire time, in the only language it has ever known, the language of strain and slip and settling grit at the bottom of the sea. And we, with all our instruments and all our detective work, with our ghost forests decoded and our orphan tsunami traced home across an ocean, and our 2 logbooks of mud laid side by side, have only barely begun to learn how to read it. We have learned to hear the fault speak. We have not yet learned to understand everything it says. We know that it moved in 1700 and that it will move again, and that it may, when it moves, wake its neighbour to the south and take the whole coast down together. What we cannot do, standing here tonight above the silence, with a century of hard-won knowledge behind us, is tell you the one thing you most want to know. And so we are left where this coast always leaves the people who are honest with themselves about it, listening to a language we are only beginning to learn, on the edge of an ocean that has crossed itself to reach us before, and will do so again on some evening we cannot name. The coast is quiet tonight. The instruments are watching, as they always are. The slab beneath the sea is still diving a few centimetres a year, the pace of a growing fingernail, exactly as it was on the night before you started listening, and exactly as it will be at dawn. The spring is still winding. The debt is still accumulating, silent, certain, indifferent, in the deep locked rock that no drill will ever reach, waiting for the day, near or unimaginably far, when 326 years of silence finally break, and the fault says, all at once, the thing it has been building towards saying since long before there was anyone here to hear it. Rest now. The ground is still, and the night is quiet, and that is enough. The coast will keep, as it has kept for 3 centuries, until morning. And when it finally speaks, whenever that is, in your lifetime, or in the lifetime of someone not yet born, at least now you will know what you were listening to all along.